episode 9 of Retrieving Reason podcast. I'm Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and today we will be discussing the critical use of reason. Last episode, we began our discussion of reason in its use, or reasoning, and we were showing some of the applications of the laws of thought, which we said was reason in itself. We made a distinction last time between the descriptive and the normative aspects of the use of reason. Remember, we talked about reason is used to form concepts, judgments, and arguments. And we said descriptively we all do this, and normatively we ought to do it well. Today, we're going to look a little further into the normative aspect of the use of reason, particularly in the critical use of reason. So another aspect of reasoning or reason in its use, the critical use of reason. Normatively, we want to say we ought to think critically if we want to arrive at meaning, truth, knowledge, understanding, and ultimately wisdom. So if we want to arrive at wisdom, we ought to use reason. Critically, we ought to use it well. But what is the critical use of reason? The critical use of reason is the primary method of philosophical thinking. It's one of the applications of philosophy, and it is the test for meaning. So the critical use of reason is the test for meaning. We want to know what things mean. And if you think about it, meaning is more basic or is logically prior to truth. Why? Because meaning is connected to concepts. Truth is connected to judgments. This is an application of presuppositional thinking. We've talked about this before, but we should mention it again. And presuppositional thinking says that we ought to address more basic issues prior to addressing less basic issues. So an application to epistemology of presuppositional thinking is that reason, what we're spending all our time talking about in this podcast, is more basic than meaning. Reason in itself, the laws of thought, is more basic than meaning. And meaning is more basic than truth. And premises in an argument are more basic than the conclusion of an argument. So notice we went over reason, concepts, judgments, arguments. In metaphysics, the infinite and the eternal concepts are more basic than finite and temporal. And in ethics, an application is that the good is prior to virtue and happiness. All right, so there's an order to our thinking, and this is part of the critical use of reason. When we find ourselves disagreeing with one another, we should stop and ask, do we disagree on more basic issues, and is that why we're not finding progress in this area? Do we need to back up and seek agreement on more basic things? All right, so let's talk about meaning is more basic than truth, because that was the first application here. This is a method that Socrates often employs. He asks for the meaning of words. Use this word justice. What does justice mean? What does that word mean? What is the reality that word signifies or represents? So if we don't understand or we don't agree upon the meaning of the terms that we use, we can't agree on the truth of statements using those words. So that's why meaning comes first. So if we don't understand what we mean when we use the word justice, then we can't understand sentences that use the word justice. So if we say, justice is the decision of the powerful person, and we say, wait, what? What does that mean? The sentence, justice is the decision of the powerful person, won't make sense if we don't first grasp that concept justice. Now, that might be a definition. So maybe we can say, is that definition meaningful? Could it possibly be that? We could think of alternatives. Maybe justice is fairness, or maybe justice is harmony of the soul. So we could test different definitions and weigh them and see what do they mean, and do the meanings of the words match the reality of the thing we call justice. All right, so meaning is more basic than truth. So let's try this out. In class, I sometimes use this statement that I guess I inherited from my professors. It's an absurd thing, but the sentence is this: Blicks are grew. Blicks are grew. Is that true or false? And students get baffled by this. What? Blicks are grew. What about this one? God is love. Is that true or false? Well, neither of those sentences is something we can just say true or false to if we don't understand what the meanings of the words are. So blicks are grew is a little more obvious, right? Because those words are words without meaning, or we haven't grasped the meaning of what those words signify. God is love, though, people use this sentence all the time, right? Well, we don't all agree on the meaning of the word God. Different people use the word differently. And love. What is love, right? So we can't say whether these sentences are true or false if we don't first agree on the meaning of the word. So that's the first application of the critical use of reason. Meaning is more basic than truth. Now, another way meaning is more basic than truth is applied is if a statement is contradictory or self-contradictory, it lacks meaning, and so it can't be true. So if I were to say blicks are non-blicks, then that's a meaningless statement because it's a violation of the law of non-contradiction, right? Blicks are non-blicks. It doesn't mean anything. God is non-God. Being is non-being. Meaningless statement, right? So something could be meaningless in two ways. We don't understand the meaning of the term, or it's a contradiction. Okay, so this is reason, the critical use of reason, the test for meaning. So let me summarize what we've done so far. There are two ways of testing for meaning. One is getting at the meaning of what a thing is. This is the level of grasping concepts, the essential feature of a thing or an idea. And the second is recognizing a contradictory statement. So two ways of testing for meaning. Now, if we agree on meaning, perhaps we can go on to truth. And the truth is the level of making judgments. And we can only make judgments that are true if those concepts are first grasped, we understand the meaning of them, and now judgments have to match reality. Today is Saturday is a judgment. Does it match reality? Is today actually Saturday? Humans are rational animals is a judgment. Is reality such that humans are rational animals? We can test that, right? All right, so let's talk about the importance of the critical use of reason. The critical use of reason is the basis for critical thinking. And critical thinking is all the rage in the academy right now, right? Everybody uses this word, critical thinking. Oh, we need to be critical thinkers. What does that mean, though? Okay, so let's ask the question, what does it mean? We already talked about what thinking is. It uses concepts, judgments, and arguments. But what is the critical part? Critical is the test for meaning. So a test for meaning rejects contradictions. And so critical thinking is going to be testing meaning. Now, where does it start? It has to start with ourselves, with self-examination. And it should start with the most basic things. What do I believe philosophically? So critical thinking should begin with ourselves, and it should test our basic beliefs. What do I think about how I know things? Does it make sense? Does it match reality? What do I think is eternal? What are my assumptions about metaphysics? What do I think is the good life? What are my assumptions about ethics? So critical thinking should be able to spot assumptions. Now, in the academy, they want us to find our biases, right? Those are your personal preferences. Perhaps you don't even recognize that you have them. The first application of critical thinking then is to our own beliefs, our own basic beliefs, and we can also apply it to biases. Critical thinking extends to other philosophies too. So philosophical systems. Can we identify assumptions out there in everyday life? Can we identify other people's assumptions? Assumptions in the media, assumptions in our textbooks, assumptions that our colleagues and our friends and family might have. Can we see assumptions about philosophy all around us? Because they are all around us. So that would be another application of critical thinking. Can we see contradictory beliefs? Should we train ourselves to do that? We ought to. This is a normative aspect, okay? So we should be able to identify our own beliefs, identify other people's beliefs, identify historical beliefs in the history of ideas, and test them for contradictions. Did you know that some basic beliefs are contradictory at the root? They say being can come from non-being, that kind of thing. So can we use reason, the laws of thought, to test basic assumptions? That's part of the critical use of reason. It takes work, it takes practice, it takes training. So back to proto-epistemology. Next, critical thinking tests worldviews for internal coherence. So our own view first, is my basic belief system coherent? And are the belief systems that I encounter in my daily life internally coherent? Are there contradictions in the system? As part of critical thinking. So we've talked about the critical use of reason as a test for meaning. Meaning is more basic than truth. And if something contradicts itself, it can't be meaningful. Now, we want to contrast the critical use of reason with what it is not. Because sometimes people, get bothered by the critical use of reason, or they use it in a maybe hyperactive way. So I want to contrast the critical use of reason with 4 things that look like the critical use of reason, or maybe question reason. And the first is mere critique. Now, Kant is a philosopher who came up with critique of pure reason. I want to read to you a little something from a book called Reason After Its Eclipse, and it's on late critical theory by Martin J. I'm going to read a long paragraph, but it helps us to see why philosophy gets confused about the critical use of reason, or why current philosophers do. I'm going to begin on page 19, towards the end if you have this book. The Age of Reason, to cite the title of Tom Paine's celebrated pamphlet defending deism, could just as easily be understood as an age of critique. So critique is the key term here. However, it might be defined, and the word has amassed many sedimented meanings. Critique implied suspicion of authority, tradition, self-evidence, and emotional appeal, demanding instead a reasoned exploration of the unacknowledged conditions of possibility, both epistemological and social, that underpinned conventional wisdom. In the preface to the first edition of his Critique of Pure Reason, Kant defined his task as the self-cognition of reason, the creation of a tribunal that will make reason secure in its rightful claims and will dismiss all baseless pretensions, not by fiat, but in accordance with reason's eternal and immutable laws. This tribunal is none other than the critique of reason itself, the critique of pure reason. The judicial metaphor employed by Kant in linking reason with critique could, however, cut both ways. That is, reason could be the judge in the tribunal of last appeal, but also the accused in the dock. Precisely how reason could be both the organon of criticism and the object of that criticism, an ambiguity neatly captured in the genitive form of Kant's formulation, remained for many later commentators unresolved, allowing them to claim that its self-grounding was really a vicious circle. All right, I'm going to pause here. This book opens this idea up really great, in a great way. But notice, critique has to do with suspicion of authority, tradition, self-evidence, emotional appeal, and conventional wisdom. Those are things we're concerned with too. But what we also have is that reason itself becomes critiqued by itself. And it's because there's a failure to self-ground reason in previous philosophical discussions. We are going to get that reason, the laws of thought are they're self-evident, they're authoritative, they are that which can't be questioned without using them. So reason is authoritative and self-attesting. We'll talk about that later on, but that's something it doesn't seem Kant got to. And so we have this problem of critique. And what happens with critical theory is they apply it to overcome that which oppresses humans and allows for greater freedom in every domain. So my second objection, contrast, what critical use of reason is not, is critical theory. Critical theory means a lot of things. It's developed by the Frankfurt School in the 1930s. But what they did want to do was overcome oppression. Problem is, what counts as oppression? And is it that traditional philosophy is the source of oppression? Or is it that we must think critically about what we mean by traditional philosophy, traditional methods, freedom, oppression? So the very terms that are used by critical theory need to be critically analyzed by the critical use of reason. So no, critical use of reason isn't mere critique. It isn't critical theory. Those philosophers who practice critique and critical theory are probably pointing out legitimate concerns, but they also don't supply answers without also having unsupported assumptions. So we shouldn't take them blindly, but we should critically analyze critical theory as well. What does it mean? What are the assumptions here? The third contrast is logocentrism. And I bring this up because at a talk I gave once, someone asked if I was suggesting that we return to logocentrism and the patriarchy. Patriarchy is going to be my fourth. But logocentrism is a critique probably popularized by Derrida, and it seems to be a critique that is against the privileging of the spoken word or the logos to the written word or writing. So speech is more important than writing. I think if we understood what reason is and what thinking is, we would notice that concepts are prior to both speech and writing, and reason is what grasps concepts. Concepts are expressed in many ways, but the meaning is in the grasping, not in the conveying. Although we do convey meaning through words and terms and symbols. But do we first understand before we convey? So we can use the critical use of reason to unpack logocentrism as well. We can also look at Derrida's critique of the metaphysics of presence and binary oppositions, the privileging of one term over another, like good is privileged over evil. Those are all assumptions, claims being made that require the critical use of reason to understand what is being said. So the critical use of reason is prior to a critique, a logocentric critique. And then the patriarchy. I don't really understand what the patriarchy is, but I'm assuming it's something like male logic over female emotion and the privileging of male logic. I am very uncomfortable with that because I'm a rational being as well, and I don't think that only males are, purveyors of logic or users of logic. I think all human beings are. So we need to think critically about claims of patriarchy as well. So I'm not claiming anything about patriarchy when we talk about reason, even though someone has maybe said that about what I'm doing. No, we're not returning to the patriarchy. We're returning to being human, and we're not even returning to that. We are retrieving that. We're rational animals. All humans use reason. The critical use of reason is a test for meaning. All of us have to test words, terms for meaning. And all right, so we talked today about the critical use of reason as a test for meaning. Meaning is more basic than truth. And next time, we're going to talk about the interpretive use of reason. And some of these things will come up again. These postmodern critical theory critiques. All right, thank you for joining me.